Cessna Citation 257 Bravo Whiskey. We've got an issue with some of our things. So please hold takeoff for runway 10. We're having some issues here. We're going to try to bring back around and land at something might be worse.
An audio clip has begun circulating related to Greg Biffle's ill-fated Cessna Citation 550. And I remember very clearly the moment I heard it for the first time.
Right now, and we're getting everything going. We're getting our gear down. 257 Bravo Whiskey's on final for runway 28.
This recording is not a distress signal, not an emergency call, but it opens a rare door allowing us to step into the final few minutes in the cockpit that day, hearing what they were trying to convey and sensing even the things they couldn't clearly express. Before analyzing that audio clip, let me take you back to that fateful morning on December 18th, 2025, around 10:15 a.m. in Statesville, North Carolina, a Cessna Citation 550 departed from runway 10. On board were 7 people: Greg Biffle, his wife, and 2 children, Dennis Dutton, his son Jack, and another pilot. Conditions at the time were marginal VFR, with low clouds and ragged cloud layers limiting outside visibility. Statesville is an uncontrolled airport, so all communications were over the Unicom frequency. Pilots self-announced their positions and intentions to other aircraft. And just minutes after the Citation left the ground, ADS-B data showed something unusual: erratic flight path, varying speeds, fluctuating altitudes, signs that any pilot would recognize as indicating something seriously wrong in the cockpit. Less than 10 minutes after takeoff, the plane crashed before it could touch the runway again. In the audio clip we're about to hear, the voice transmitting the announcements sounds like the co-pilot's, though it's not clear exactly who it was. The important thing is that this person made 3 consecutive transmissions, and all 3 carried the same message: they were experiencing issues and needed space to return. And this is where we hear the first statement in the recording: Statesville traffic.
Cessna Citation 257 Bravo Whiskey. We've got an issue with
For any pilot who's flown into an uncontrolled field, just hearing those 2 words tells you immediately they're transmitting on the Unicom frequency, where pilots self-announce positions, intentions, and warnings to surrounding aircraft. There's no controller there to ask what's wrong, no one requiring them to describe the situation, and so what they say is entirely up to how much they can share in that chaotic moment. Following that opening, the person in the cockpit continues.
We've got an issue with
We're having trouble with, and then the sentence trails off. It's unclear if he was interrupted or trying to find the exact words, or simply too many things were happening at once, preventing him from stringing the thoughts together. Then right after that, another phrase rings out: a few things of ours, a vague, roundabout way of speaking that doesn't specify which system, which component, or exactly what the problem was. From my flying experience, that way of speaking isn't because they didn't want to say it, but because they couldn't at Statesville. An airport without air traffic control transmitting on Unicom isn't for declaring an emergency, but for warning other aircraft to stay clear. If they were on radar or approach frequency, they'd be required to describe it immediately. What malfunction, which engine, how urgent, but here, no one to question them back. They were just trying to send out the minimum needed for other pilots to understand.
We've got an issue with some of our things. So please hold takeoff for runway 10.
Precisely because of the lack of technical context, this audio clip opens up many hypotheses. Was it an engine failure? Very possible. ADS-B shows unusual speed changes, erratic path, things a Citation 550 would experience immediately with only one engine operating. Or perhaps the baggage compartment door opened, something that's happened on Citations before, creating sudden drag and severe vibration, forcing an immediate return. It could also be control issues like trim malfunction, failure in the pitch control system, or multiple warnings flashing at once, turning the cockpit into chaos. Hearing how the person in the cockpit repeated trouble in plural form, it's not hard to imagine they might have been facing multiple warnings simultaneously, or a single failure triggering a chain reaction. But this audio, though valuable, doesn't tell us exactly what, and that's the most heartbreaking part. they were fighting something we can only guess at. Another important point is in the voice itself. When listening closely, you'll notice the transmitting voice doesn't sound like that of a 67-year-old airline veteran, experienced and seasoned with deep composure. The voice sounds younger, lighter, slightly lacking the firmness and calm of a longtime captain. This leads many to speculate it might have been Jack Dutton, Dennis's son, a pilot in training, familiar with radio calls, but not yet experienced enough to use precise professional terminology. But once again, we can't confirm. We only know that person was doing their best to transmit the minimum information to surrounding aircraft. While they themselves might have been in an emergency they hadn't fully grasped yet, saying we're having multiple troubles carries heavy meaning in a flight context. When you're at low altitude, in clouds, just minutes after takeoff, with enormous workload, especially if essentially flying single pilot, such a statement tells you the cockpit was extremely tense. The Citation 550 isn't an easy plane to handle in abnormal situations. Straight wings create high drag when slowing. Losing one engine causes severe yaw, and with low clouds, vibration, constant warnings, just a few seconds of instability can spiral out of control. And then the second statement rings out.
We're having a ground condition here. We're going to try to bring it back around and land it.
I knew they'd made the final decision. They would return to the field and attempt to land immediately. When a crew announces dropping gear at low altitude in abnormal conditions, it shows they're entering the committed phase. No many options left but to get the plane on the ground as soon as possible. Dropping gear means starting to configure the aircraft for landing, and that configuration always adds drag, something a troubled Citation 550 can easily get punished for. Looking at the flight path from ADS-B data, we see they started turning back quite early, possibly initially intending to re-enter for runway 10, the one they just departed from. But for some reason they abandoned that and began a teardrop-style turn to approach runway 28 from the opposite direction. And this is the point that unsettles any pilot looking at it. The turn back to runway 28 was too tight, too steep compared to the wide and comfortable turn they made on departure. A Citation, especially in abnormal state, isn't suited for such tight turns. When you're already unstable, gear down, suspecting engine issues, and making a tight turn, you're putting the plane in the most dangerous regime, speed bleeding off fast. Lift dropping in just a few degrees off angle of attack means insufficient lift to stay airborne. I can clearly picture the scene. One engine possibly weak or vibrating, gear down, flaps likely extended, and the Citation slowing at a speed it shouldn't. All this happening in weather many pilots would describe as not pleasant at all. The low clouds that day were ragged, uneven, patchy, torn layers, creating moments of visibility, then plunging back into whiteout. One moment you see the ground, the next you're in a solid layer. For a plane in trouble, this causes rapid loss of altitude awareness. And if in the cockpit only one person was truly qualified to handle it, essentially single pilot technically, then the workload could exceed anyone's capacity. When you also have to constantly counter yaw from asymmetric thrust, monitor speed, control bank angle, while trying to find a clear enough patch to see the runway, every second becomes pressure. With the Citation 550, the straight wing characteristics make it agile, but create massive drag when slowing or with gear and flaps out. Sudden drag increase causes speed to drop rapidly, and in a steep turn that can cause the plane to mush down before the pilot can react. If one engine was truly problematic, the Citation becomes even harder to control. One engine at full power to compensate makes severe yaw, forcing constant rudder input to maintain heading. Each correction bleeds more speed. Putting myself in their position, I can feel the pressure tightening every second. When you're low and slow, just a few vibrations or a few extra degrees of bank can drop the flight path to unrecoverable levels. And that's why this second audio is so significant. It's not long, not detailed, but it tells us clearly they were trying desperately to return, but under extremely disadvantageous conditions, high drag, tight turn, low clouds, dropping speed, and little time left. And then the final statement rings out.
257 Bravo whiskey's on final for runway 28, 62,
Just that, and then silence. For a pilot, hearing someone announce on final usually means they've sighted the runway, stabilized heading, and are preparing to touch down. But in this case, that statement doesn't represent a stabilized approach. It only tells us they managed to point the nose toward runway 28, but not whether they were at safe altitude or appropriate speed. Looking at ADS-B data, we know at the time of announcing final, their speed was around 106 knots, lower than normal for a Citation 550 in abnormal conditions. And even more concerning is the altitude. When a plane is about 1 nautical mile from the runway, ideal altitude should be around 300 feet above ground. That's a standard ratio, simple, every pilot knows by heart. 1 mile, 300 feet, 2 miles, 600 feet, 3 miles, 900 feet. That's the standard glide slope to ensure sufficient lift, speed, and time to handle anything. But the Citation that day was much lower than standard, low enough to hit the approach lights before reaching the runway. And hitting approach lights means you're well below the glide slope, a margin that's dangerous even in good weather, let alone with low clouds and aircraft issues. Additionally, they were in landing configuration, gear down, flaps likely extended. Both create enormous drag, pulling speed down faster than the pilot can control if engines aren't responding fully. If one engine was weak or not performing, the remaining one has to strain to keep the plane aloft. But the Citation 550 isn't powerful enough to muscle the plane with all that drag on one engine alone. When your low, slow, and full drag climb capability is nearly zero, this leads to the concept controlled flight into terrain. Not loss of control, not free fall, but the plane still flying, still controllable, but at too low altitude and too slow speed to clear obstacles ahead. That's exactly what happened. They were trying to approach, but too low and too slow to maintain a safe glide slope. As the gear entered denser air in the cloud layer and drag pulled the plane down, lift was no longer sufficient to hold the glide slope. Just a few degrees extra bank in the prior tight turn, or just a few knots lost when the engine didn't respond and the path drops to unrecoverable. The moment they announced on final they were no longer in a recoverable position, they were fighting gravity, drag, weather, and an aircraft no longer fully capable. And it all unfolded in those final tens of seconds where hope was almost out of reach. Looking back at all three transmissions, we can see quite clearly what the crew was trying to convey amid the chaos. First, they clearly stated they were having trouble, not one, but multiple. The way they repeated the word shows multiple abnormal indications appearing at once in the cockpit. Second, they proactively warned other aircraft in the area, requesting to stay clear, keep the airspace open for their return. That shows they still had enough control to think of other safety, even while in peril themselves. Third, they confirmed their intent to land on runway 28, shown by announcing final and configuring for landing, but alongside what the audio tells us, there's a huge gap. The things it doesn't say. We don't know exactly what failure they faced, don't know which engine malfunctioned, or if it was engines or another system, don't know who was directly at the controls, a seasoned captain or a young pilot trying to assist to the best of their ability. And most importantly, none of us, even listening hundreds of times, can determine why they descended low enough to hit the approach lights before seeing the runway from a pilot's perspective. All this paints a very heavy picture of the cockpit. Then, workload likely exceeded limits. Just one abnormality after takeoff, plus weather, plus a tight turn, and the brain is processing too much. Stress certainly high. Your minutes after takeoff in clouds with an unstable aircraft. Vibration from an engine, if present, would worsen everything. Shaking makes instruments hard to read, hard to hold straight path. Ragged cloud layer causes constant loss and regain of visibility, unable to rely fully on eyes or fully on instruments. Drag from gear and flaps, especially with only one good engine, turns the Citation into an anchor pulling down. And if in the cockpit only one person was legally qualified to fly with the other just assisting, then CRM in this case would be severely disadvantaged. A father trying to hold the plane, a son trying to help, both pulled into the vortex of workload and time pressure, all leading to questions still open and likely only answered when remaining data is fully analyzed. Why didn't they climb straight out before turning back? A standard technique for post-takeoff issues. Why was the turn to runway 28 so tight when with any abnormality, wider turns are safer? And why not divert to Charlotte, a larger airport, longer runways, better facilities, instead of trying to return to Statesville? The three transmissions help piece together part of the picture, but many pieces are still missing. And looking back at that entire short flight, what haunts me most is the crew's spirit in those final minutes. Despite facing dire emergency, they still keyed the mic, still transmitted announcements, still warned other aircraft they were having trouble in returning. In the aviation world, that speaks volumes about the character of those at the controls when everything is collapsing around you, when the cockpit might be shaking from instability, when altitude is dropping fast and time is running out. It's easy for a pilot to succumb to panic or focus solely on keeping the plane aloft. But they were different. They still used the Unicom frequency, still announced positions, still clearly stated intent to approach runway 28. That shows they maintained minimum composure in a situation where anyone could lose control. They didn't go silent. They didn't give up. They fought to the last minute. And that makes the loss that day even more heartbreaking. When we talk about this accident, we're not just talking about a Citation 550 crashing into the ground. We're talking about the Biffle family, husband and wife, children, people with entire lives ahead. We're talking about the Dutton father and son, a father who was an airline pilot, deeply experienced, and a son still on the journey to becoming one. And we're talking about the final companion who was on that flight, trusting they would all return together. One moment, just one decision off by seconds, or one failure at the wrong time took 7 lives. And every time I listen to that audio again, I don't just hear vague words, but effort, tension, determination. We analyze not to blame anyone, not to assign fault or point out what they should have done differently. We analyze to understand, to learn, to ensure that in the future, another pilot in another cockpit has a few extra seconds to make the right decision and avoid repeating this tragedy. This Citation 550 accident, like every other, contains lessons every pilot needs to remind themselves daily. First is the standard of stabilized approach. Once on final, if speed is below minimum, if altitude is below glide slope, if drag is too high, recovery chances are extremely slim. An unstabilized approach must be abandoned immediately, no matter the conditions. But for that crew, they may have had no option to go around being in too disadvantaged a state. Second lesson is handling abnormal engine situations. Losing thrust on one engine after takeoff is a scenario every pilot trains for, but handling severe vibration, shaking cockpit, bad weather, and low altitude, that's a challenge beyond theory. Yaw from the good engine can veer the plane, forcing heavy rudder, and just seconds of imbalance drops speed to dangerous levels. Third lesson is the combination of workload and weather. Low clouds aren't a big issue for IFR-capable aircraft, but when trouble hits right after takeoff, constant in and out of clouds causes rapid loss of altitude, speed, and bank awareness. Workload skyrockets, and that's always the silent enemy in the cockpit. And finally, the most important lesson: when unsure, climb straight ahead. Every pilot is taught this: climb out, gain altitude, gain time, then troubleshoot. When near the ground, every decision is in seconds. But if the failure comes too early or the plane can't climb, that option may no longer be viable. That's why we must wait for full data to understand why they didn't climb straight instead of turning back. And now, looking back at everything, the only thing we can do is respect them. Respect the crew's final effort, respect those who perished, and respect the truth that none of us, even the most experienced, can know exactly what it felt like in that cockpit that day. What we're doing here is just professional analysis based on what we hear and see, nothing more. The full, detailed, and objective truth, we still have to wait for it. I hope, when all reports are released, the remaining questions will be answered. But until then, we maintain respect, maintain empathy, and maintain the spirit of learning from what happened. If you find these analyses helpful, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future updates, and hit the bell for notifications when new videos come out. Thank you for joining and supporting the journey of exploring flight safety with me.